Hi, and welcome to a very special edition of Capturing Christianity. Today we're talking about the Israel-Palestine conflict, the 2021 conflict. That's also important. We'll talk about that today. There's been a lot of conflict over the years, but today I've invited Dr. Marc Turnage, who's been on the channel before, and he's got a really awesome ministry. I highly recommend that you go check him out. Go check out our previous interview that we've done. But Marc is an Israeli. I've got this on the screenshot or the thumbnail of this video. He's an Israeli guide, so he goes over to Israel all the time. He's a sort of insider into Israel. At least that's the reason why I want to invite him on the show to talk about this conflict, is because he's got an insider perspective. Even though he's an American, he's been over there multiple times. He has relationships with the folks over there. He knows the history. And so I want to get, this is kind of like a personal thing for me. I want to learn more about this conflict because I really only see one narrative in the media and everything. And I want to get a kind of, as best we can, an unbiased view of what this conflict is, how it started, what are the ins and outs of it. Obviously the main narrative that's going on right now is that Israel is this really bad power that's sort of just pummeling Palestine, killing children, murdering innocents, and that's kind of the narrative that's being pushed right now. But I want to get, like, is that really the correct narrative? Is that the way that we should actually look at this conflict between these two things? Obviously, there was a war. I think it was it just ended recently, or there's a ceasefire recently. But anyways, Marc, go ahead and jump in and just give us a kind of overview of what is going on over there in Israel right now.
Well, Cameron, thanks for having me on again. I want to start by saying, first of all, the New York Times columnist Tom Friedman has said it best, that in the Middle East, everyone has their version. And so I recognize that. I also recognize that this is a very kind of emotional issue for a lot of people. And so before we dive in just to how we got to the present conflict, I want to kind of clean up our nomenclature a little bit, because I think this is where a lot of people stumble. And when we talk about Israel and Palestine, we really need to think in terms of three categories of how people get identified. First is political. And there we speak about Israeli and Palestinian. That is the same of speaking about someone from the United States and a Canadian. These are political designations. And this is very important because, as we'll probably get to in our conversation today, the term Palestinian is going to be a moving target depending on when in history you use it. So as of today, when we use this terminology, Israeli and Palestinian, we're talking about political entities. Then the second category is going to be something that's more ethnic. And of the two primary ethnic groups within Israel and Palestine are going to be Jews and Arabs. Now, understand something a second. Within the Palestinian group, again, that's we're defining that politically, most everyone are Arabs. However, in Israel, not only do you have Jews, but you also have Arabs who are Israeli citizens. In fact, about 20% of the population. So it is wrong to think that Arab equals Palestinian, just like it's wrong to assume that Israeli equals Jewish. And then the third category is religious. And here we primarily have the three monotheistic faiths: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So just so we're clear, I can speak about an Israeli Arab Christian. I can speak about an Israeli Arab Muslim. I can speak about a Palestinian Arab Christian, a Palestinian Arab Muslim. And one of the problems that happens in all of this is that we kind of want to blend these lines. And I get that I'm oversimplifying here a little bit, but I'm doing it because too often we don't make those distinctions in how we deal with the people groups that are in this region. Now, where we get to today, that I need to introduce kind of a fourth group. And these are the Arabs of East Jerusalem. Now, these are neither Palestinian or Israeli. They kind of get caught up in the modern history of Jerusalem going back to times like 1948 and 1967. These East Jerusalem Arabs, which can be both Christian and Muslim, are simply Jerusalemites. And that is going to affect their status within both Israel and also in terms of their relationship within like the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, what we think of in terms of Palestine. So that's really where the current story begins. That about a month ago, the Muslim festival of Ramadan began. And within Jerusalem, of course, over this last year with COVID, and we felt that throughout the world, there have been increasing tensions between some of the East Jerusalem Arabs and some of the Jewish people in Jerusalem. And this begins to get exacerbated about a month ago in Jerusalem. Of course, as part of Ramadan, Muslims are going on top of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which is, of course, the holy site for Muslims in Jerusalem, where you have the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And because of this kind of growing unrest, there were certain restrictions that Israeli police were putting on that action. At the same time, there was a court case in the Jerusalem court. It has not gone to the Israeli Supreme Court yet, where there was some disputed land in a community, an Arab community in East Jerusalem called Sheikh Jarrah. And the dispute on this land has gone back into really post-1967, but it's been in the Israeli court since the 1970s. And what happened is the Jerusalem court basically said that the Arab families living in these homes had to either pay back rent to the Jewish families that owned the deed on the land, or they needed to leave. And so that kind of got whipped up. And then also just really when all the rocket fire started that we've been watching on the news and so forth coming out of Gaza, that started because you have what is called Jerusalem Day. This is a day that is celebrated every year, and it remembers the event in 1967 when Israeli troops took, up until from 1948 to 1967, West Jerusalem was under the control of the state of Israel. East Jerusalem was under the control of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. And in 1967, as part of the Six-Day War, Israel, the state of Israel, now took control of all of Jerusalem, both West and East Jerusalem. And that's remembered on Jerusalem Day. And so that's where the rocket fire begins about 2 weeks ago.
Okay, there's a lot of information there. I also want to let everyone know that I've noticed it's kind of like skipping his video. Marc's video is kind of like skipping all over. I don't know what's going on with that. Marc and I had some other technical issues in our previous podcast or YouTube video. So eventually we're going to get to the bottom of this. But fortunately, you can still hear his voice clearly. I'm assuming that you can hear his voice clearly. You can actually let me know in the live chat if everything's coming through. So if it's too distracting for you, just listen to it through your headphones. So let's get... I just want to get a little bit more clarity. I really like the distinctions that you made at the very beginning when you were talking about how, in Palestine, you can have someone who's Arab, but then also a Christian. So I think that what we tend to do, Americans in the West, is that we tend to sort of lump everything together, create a really simplistic narrative, and then be like, this person's being a bully to this person, and that's it, basically. And I think what you're trying to do is introduce a little bit of nuance and say that it's not that simple. Whole lot more going on here. As you already mentioned, there's the 6-Day War you've got to take into consideration, Jerusalem Day. All of these different things are sort of coming together to create the conflict that's just been boiling and boiling and boiling. And I think that, like,
Right.
I mean, do you think that over time this is kind of inevitable? Like the sort of tension that exists in that land right now is just, it's inevitable. It's going to happen again. Like, even though there's a sort of ceasefire that was announced recently, it seems like the tensions are just so high, and there doesn't really seem to be an end in sight. Like, we're gonna eventually get to this place again.
I think, unfortunately, that is correct, and I think that part of the challenge, particularly that we in the West have, is the fact that we tend to project on the rest of the world our views, our ideologies, and what we value. And one of the things that you have within the peoples that live in Israel is the land gets tied up as part of their faith constructs. And again, for many of us in the West, we tend to, because our faith may impact things like how we live, how we vote, those kinds of things, but we can live out our faith separated from things like land and ritual and so forth. And so that's not the situation when you get to the land of Israel and Palestine. And when you're talking about these people groups, there is very much a connection between faith and land. And we can't ignore that when we want to frame out the what's going on and trying to really understand where the various sides are coming from there.
Yeah, one of the questions I've got is, like, in the news and everything, what you see these videos of, like, Israelis basically informing these buildings, the people that are in these buildings, like, hey guys, we're about to bomb this building, and then they're bombed, and then afterwards you see video and horrible pictures of, fathers losing their children and stuff. So let's talk about that. I know that's really difficult to talk about, but let's talk about that. Like, what's going on with these, like, how are these people dying? What's going on?
Well, I one of the things that I think is kind of an unfair comment that gets made, and I've heard it a lot recently over the last 10 days, is talking about Israel's disproportionate strength. Clearly, when you are the stronger in any kind of interaction, you have a responsibility to control that strength. But the one thing that that if Israel, for example, did not have their Iron Dome system, which is not built for attack purposes, but simply to protect against incoming missiles, then what would the 3,000 rockets that were fired over the last 2 weeks from Gaza have done in Israel? Israel does try to mitigate loss of civilians. Unfortunately, even as we in the United States saw, whether we're talking about Iraq or Afghanistan, that's not always possible to do. And this is not me absolving Israel from the responsibilities that it has, but it has to be taken into consideration the nature of the conflict that was being created there. Unfortunately, as even the U.S. saw in, like, Iraq and Afghanistan, the other side sometimes will use civilian populations as a way of shielding themselves. And unfortunately, what happens is, civilian casualty happens. War's horrible. I think anyone would agree with that. And unfortunately, when you look at the history of warfare throughout human existence, it's often those who are the innocent that wind up suffering the most.
Yeah, I also want to make it clear. It seems like we're getting some comments saying that this is like an apartheid channel and like we're basically just trying to defend Israel or anything. Neither of us are trying to do that. I don't think. I mean, that's not my goal. My goal personally is to understand the conflict and understand, like, just better understand what's going on over there, because I don't live there. I've been there once, but I don't really understand. And so I just want to get some more clarity and kind of just better understand the conflict. But then also, we were talking about this before we went live, is that like Israel's not, their hands are not clean in this. You know, when you're dealing with something like war, there's going to be oftentimes there's casualties, there's civilian casualties, and that's just it's so horrible. And so a lot of these images, the moral intuitions that those evoke, I think those are correct. Like, those are good moral intuitions. It's bad. Like, this is a really horrible thing that is happening over here. And so, but what we're not trying to do is excuse Israel. We're also not trying to excuse Palestine. We're not trying to excuse any of these groups. We're just trying to say this is some of the reasons why these things are developing. And then also, sorry, I'm still sipping on my Chick-fil-A lunch, but we're also just trying to understand and introduce a little bit of nuance into the situation, because that's not happening in the media. You're not seeing, you're not getting any of this from any sort of media outlet that's just telling this sort of simplistic narrative of Israel is this bully, and you're not really digging into the details. And so that was my purpose for today, was just to better understand everything. Do you have any comments on that? And that this is not an attempt to defend Israel or say that they're...
No, I think that I would just echo what you said, Cameron, that one of the problems right now on this conversation is we in the West lack nuance, not only in the present situation, but in what was the history that led here. And there's blood on both sides of the tracks here, and there is plenty of blame to go around. But I don't think that, laying blame at one or the other is, where we should leave it. But we do need to understand what were the actions that have led to these various behaviors by these communities. I will say I disagree with the characterization of Israel as an apartheid state. It's that just doesn't seem to reflect an understanding of really going back to where I started with these nuances of these groups. And let me explain what I'm saying here. As I said before, 20% of Israel's population are Arabs, Muslims, and Christians. That means that they have full voting rights within the democratic state of Israel. That means that they have representation in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. That means they have an Israeli passport and they can travel freely anywhere inside of Israel and even going out of Israel. When we talk about Gaza and the West Bank, particularly, and this gets back to the whole issue of the Oslo Accords back in the early 90s, but what is called Area A of the West Bank. These are the large Palestinian cities like Bethlehem, Hebron, Ramallah, Nablus, Jericho, Jenin, right? Both the cities of Area A and Gaza are under Palestinian control, both in terms of civic government and in terms of policing. So just like I can't necessarily go free between the border of the United States and Mexico without having to go through some level of a checkpoint, that's kind of the situation there. Now, I'm not trying to say that it's that easy, but it's hard for me to say that there is an apartheid state, that Israel's an apartheid state, when it provides for its Arab citizens the same level of freedoms that you find within any democratic state. Now, having said that, just like in the United States at times, we've wrestled with our minority communities, right? I mean, the essence of democracy sometimes means that minorities wind up being hurt in the democratic process. Israel also has problems with its minority communities. But to say that Israel is an apartheid state, again, this is part of the problem that we find where the Oslo Accords of the early 90s were not intended to be a permanent solution. But because the two sides have not been able to reach a permanent solution, they've become somewhat permanent, and it has not benefited anyone in the process.
So I want to talk now about Hamas and their role in this, and then also, Hamas is it classified technically or officially as a terrorist organization?
That was the term President Biden used in his address today.
Okay, so tell me more about Hamas, because I don't know anything about Hamas. Tell me about Hamas and their role in all of this.
Well, this is important because one of the things that again, going back to this issue of nuance, people don't realize that part of what's going on over the last 2 weeks is really a power play within Palestinian politics. You have two major parties within Palestinian politics. You have Hamas, and they are based in Gaza. And then you have the Palestinian Authority, what is called Fatah, which is in the West Bank. If you've ever heard of Mahmoud Abbas or Abu Mazen, it's the same person, but he is the head of the Palestinian Authority. So 15 years ago, in Gaza, there was an election. Hamas kind of takes control. They also drive Fatah out of Gaza a bit. And so there's been this, since then, really this power play within the Palestinian world as to who's going to be in charge and seen as the leaders, the defenders of the Palestinian people. Is it going to be Hamas or is it going to be Fatah? And one of the things that I think is important to notice that over the last 2 weeks, when you've had this fighting going on between Israel and Gaza, that the West Bank has been relatively quiet, which tells you that part of what's going on here is in part a play within the internal Palestinian politics between Fatah and Hamas, because Hamas very much wants to be, like I said, the defenders of the Palestinian people. They also want to be in control of the Palestinian holy site, the Temple Mount, where you have the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. And so Hamas, out of Gaza, they have routinely created, the last one being back in 2014, the last major war between Israel and Hamas. And part of their charter is the eradication of what they see and call the Zionist occupier. In other words, the state of Israel. And so this is where we get this constant tension between Hamas and Israel. Of course, there were Israeli settlers in the Gaza Strip that were removed back in the 2000s by the late Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. So the whole Gaza Strip now is under the control of Hamas. The people in Gaza suffer. The last incident, the last war between Israel and Hamas brought in roughly $4 billion in aid to Gaza. And yet the Palestinian people living in Gaza, the average daily wage is about $1 to $2 a day, but yet, the leadership received this obscene amount of money that was intended, very rightfully so, to help, rebuild and create infrastructure and so forth. But that didn't happen.
So I want to let the audience know, I do want to reserve some time here today for some Q&A. So if you've got a question for Dr. Turnage, let me know in the live chat. I also want to mention one more time that this is a very emotional topic. It's already being expressed in the live chat. So please try to keep it civil. Obviously, emotions are high right now, and we even got, it looks like we have some people who are from the land over there themselves. So, but if you do have a question for Dr. Turnage, please leave it in the live chat. I'll try to favorite them as we continue our conversation here, and then we'll get to some of those in just a little bit. So one question I've got is, you already mentioned at the very beginning of this stream some of the factors that come into play that sort of ignited this war, but what was there one specific event that really sticks out as a sort of antagonist?
It depends on who you ask. I mean, early on in the conflict, that the recent one, many people were pointing to this issue with the houses, these Arab residents in Sheikh Jarrah. Um, Maybe that's the tipping point. But like I said, through the month of Ramadan, there had been this kind of boiling, and I think that it also when you look at the last year, and the impact that the COVID pandemic has had worldwide. I mean, of course, it has absolutely killed any kind of tourism in Israel, and people have been hurt and by that, right? And so I think that that has also led to just kind of some of the tensions being right under the surface there. That with Ramadan, with some of the policing that was going on during Ramadan, that things just kind of ignited, and then with the Jerusalem Day and the firing of rockets from Gaza, in correlation with that, it continued to spiral.
Here's a question that came in from Samuel Blackmon. He says, is there any truth to the reports of the use of white phosphorus by Israel?
I don't know.
Fair enough. I mean, we do know that they were using other means, right? And same on the other side as well. Palestine was using rockets, and Israel's got that Iron Dome, but there were casualties still on both sides,
right?
And quite a bit. Okay, here's one from a guy named Skeptic. I just want to ask the doctor, if Israel is right in what it's doing, then why are Palestinian children suffering every day and dying without any mercy? And why is that occupation?
Well, I think that everybody is feels and hurts for the suffering of the innocent. And make no mistake, there's innocent suffering on both sides here. I think that how we understand where we're at today really begins with how where we start our story and how we tell our story. And I think that one of the problems that we fall into a trap too easily into in the West is we want to pick one side or the other and make it a very binary argument. And I always tell people, when you start telling your story matters. And I'm not even talking about, well, this is the land of the Bible or what. That's not an argument really, in my opinion, on this issue. I'm talking in modern history. Where do you begin telling this story, and how do you begin, looking at the situations that brought to this point? I will say this: there have been innocent Palestinian children that have suffered and died because of this. At the same time, there is a hospital in Ashkelon, the Barzilai Hospital, that has one of the best cardiac units in the Middle East. And the doctors in the Barzilai Hospital in the last conflict with Gaza chose to stay in the hospital with their patients, many of whom were Palestinians from Gaza, children even. While the hospital was being targeted by rockets, that doctors chose to stay there with their patients as opposed to going and seeking shelter in the bomb shelters and stuff like this. So if we, again, how we tell the story matters. And I think that we have an obligation to try and tell it as fairly as we can from both sides. And if we look only for the dirt on from one side, we'll find a lot of it. If we only look at it from the other, we'll do the same. But if we are trying to understand where we're coming from and realizing, and I think that one of the problems here is we tend to level out and say, this is Israel, this is Palestine. And I think even within the conversation up to now, I've tried to illustrate that there are nuances even among the Palestinian people. My friends, my Christian Palestinian friends in the West Bank are not interested in having Hamas rule the West Bank because they understand what that would mean for them as Christians. At the same time, going back to the nature of the state of Israel, the only country within the modern Middle East where the local Arab Christians are either maintaining their numbers or growing is the democratic state of Israel. Not in Gaza, not in the West Bank, not in Jordan, not in Egypt, not in Syria. And I think those things have to be brought into our understanding of this situation and recognize that there's more nuance here than just seeing it through the lens of bad and good, evil and righteous, or however you want to frame that.
So a question that I've got, and we've got a bunch of them that have come in, so we'll get to those in just a moment. But the question I have now is about the U.S. and what has the U.S. response been to this? I know you said that President Biden just talked about this today. What did he talk about? What's his stance on this? If you can gather as much as a stance from him, what is the U.S. response to this conflict so far?
Well, I think that you've seen a real split within the United States. I think you've even seen on our streets, a real rise in anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish attacks that have been happening, from New York to LA to Utah to Chicago, right? President Biden has, in his statement today, he did praise, or at least congratulate Israel on, ratcheting down the escalation coming to this. But at the same time, he said that Israel has a right to defend itself against any rocket attacks on its civilian population. You have pushes going on right now by certain elements in Congress looking to block, censor U.S. support, military support to Israel as a way of trying to control Israel there a bit. That's a bit more complicated than just turning off the spigot. But then you have others that say that Israel obviously has the right to defend itself. But President Biden also said that he feels that both Israelis and Palestinians should have the right to live in peace and in security and in a functioning democracy. So
I want to get this comment out there.
Response.
Yasser Masood says, and this is a sort of personal attack against you. He says, LOL, he keeps talking nuance, but blames the Arabs for everything. He's talking about you.
I know. No, I'm not blaming the Arabs for everything at all. Not even in the least. I mean, when you go back into even the early 20th century, prior to the founding of the State of Israel, and of course the UN Partition Plan in 1947 that creates that, You have Jewish atrocities against Arab communities. You have, with the establishment of the state of Israel, you had Arabs that lost farms and land and so forth. Really that whole episode goes back into the 19th century when the land was being governed by the Turkish Ottomans. And as Jewish settlement began to come into the land and they would buy the land deeds from the Ottomans and then go and you would have the displacement of local Arab farmers on those lands. So this is not me saying that everything is the result or the fault of the Arabs, but at the same time that we have, for example, let's just talk about Jerusalem for a moment. The area of the German colony is an area where, of course, there used to be Arab farms that were taken over. At the same time, in 1948, when the Jordanians illegally occupied East Jerusalem and the West Bank as a result of the 1948 war, you had the forced expulsion of Jews in East Jerusalem. And that's really even where this issue, and it's a legal issue, that's been in the Jerusalem court about these homes in Sheikh Jarrah. Now, I understand that, and again, the legal side of this, there are arguments to be made legally by both sides. And this is an issue this is a case that will probably go to the Israeli Supreme Court. Having said that, I understand that part of the emotion of this is because you do have places in Jerusalem, around Jerusalem, and elsewhere where you have had Arabs displaced from the land. But to say it as only as the Jews have displaced the Arabs and not vice versa, I mean, the reality is that the 1948 war displaced more Jews from Arab lands, like in Syria, like in Iraq, in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Morocco, than you had Arabs displaced within what became the state of Israel. Now, again, I'm not trying to make an equivalency here that, well, they did this and they did this. That's not my point, but to try and understand that there is a nuance to this and that it's not a blame. I'm not looking to blame one side or over the other. Please hear me clearly. Fault, there's enough fault in this to go around. I've got a good friend that her comment is, well, what's the next right thing? And I think that we have to look at that, but we also have to understand how we've wound up where we are today.
So here's a question. This is going to help bring some more clarity from Shane Montz. He says, is this conflict primarily over land or is it mainly religious? Does either side have a rightful claim to the land?
Wow.
Isn't that the question?
It really is. It really is a question. And I think that one of the things that we have to understand in the West, whether we are secular or religious, our definition of religion is very Protestant. And even when you start looking at Europeans in the 18th and 19th century beginning to encounter other religions, Hinduism, Islam, and even Judaism, they begin to try and box them and frame them in very Protestant ways of looking at religion. The reality is that both Judaism and Islam have very much a tie to sacred land. For 2,000 years, every Passover, Jews have said next year in Jerusalem. Okay, so the land was a part of Judaism. At the same time, within Islam, the way that Islam looks at the world is you have what you call Dar al-Islam, which is the world of Islam, and you have Dar al-Harb, which is the world of the sword. Now, any place, any piece of land that has ever been under the administration and control of Islam is considered waqf, sacred land. It doesn't become unsacred, even if the land gets lost to Islamic rule. And so this is one of the problems when you start looking at, going back even, Cameron, to your earlier question, some of the challenges and this kind of almost an impasse that you find yourselves in with today, because what has happened, I lived in Israel. I started living there in the mid 90s, right? So shortly after the Oslo Accords, and I came to Israel right after the assassination of the Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. And there was a lot of enthusiasm for the possibility of a two-state solution and so forth. Like I said, the Oslo Accords were intended to be temporary. But what happened as a result of the events in the early 2000s, what's called the Second Intifada, is the left and the center of Israel moved right. And in their moving right, there's also a certain religious connection that came along with that. At the same time, within the Muslim community, you also have the what we've seen happen is more the Islamification of the Muslim community. So now we've got these two groups who are arguing. I mean, part of the reason why you see Jewish settlers that live in the West Bank making the argument is because the West Bank is the heart of biblical Israel. And so they're saying this is the land that God gave to us. At the same time, when you look at how, whether we're talking about Hamas or what you see in the West Bank, these ideas that there will be a Palestinian state that goes from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, that goes to the heart of this idea that the land is waqf. And so I think that it's important to realize that, yes, you can't separate land from religion in these two communities. It's part of it. And it has only grown more so over the last 20 years.
So here's a question from Jimmy Gray, different topic. Why does no one talk about Islamic and Arab imperialism, colonialism, and apartheid, and the influence of Islamic theology, which clearly vilifies Jews?
Again, I think that this comes from the fact that often in the West, we are not familiar with history. We're not always good students of history. At the same time, I think that we tend to approach, like I said before, we tend to approach religions very much through a very Protestant view of religion. And so we tend to think that the way that we think about religion is how everybody else thinks about it. And that's a huge mistake, I think, within the West. I've often said, I mean, I remember when I was a young graduate student moving to Israel, and my first July in Israel, which was hot, and you see these religious, Orthodox Jews, you see these religious Muslims who their entire life is framed around their faith. What they wear. I mean, in the middle of the summer, they're wearing long clothes, right? I mean, I'm wanting to shed, I'm wanting shorts and a t-shirt, and they're having their modesty, and they're 5 times a day of prayer. And, I think that one of the things that is hard for us in the West, even those of us who are people of faith, to really understand is a community that will pray 5 times a day, that will arrange their diet and their lifestyle around their faith rhythms. That's not something that we really understand often in Western cultures. And so I think that this is a part of that, why we don't necessarily realize what you see within the history, whether it's of Islam or even in the history of Judaism.
So I want to remind everyone who's watching, if you like this type of content, subscribe to this channel, like the video. You can share it with some friends. It's a good way to support the channel. And so let's get to another question here. This one is from Billy G. Really insightful question. And I also want to get your response to this, Dr. Turnage. He says, can anyone who disagrees with Israel's response provide what an acceptable response would be? Saying Israel just has to take the rocket attacks isn't one. So we've also commented on how we don't agree with Israel's response because civilians have died and children have died. So obviously we're not sanctioning those types of actions. But at the same time, what would be a good response from Israel, or what would and this is kind of getting at the heart of like why war is so terrible. It's because like how do you actually respond to rocket attacks? It's just, I mean, maybe for other people it's super clear what should be done, but it's not clear to me.
I'm not going to claim to have the answer for that. I think that I think we have to recognize a few things here. It to me, these rocket attacks do not solve anything for the Palestinians or the Israelis. I think that, frankly, I'm not a fan of Hamas. I'm sorry, I'll go on record as saying that. But I think that one of the things that you've seen in the West Bank since the early 2000s, when you had the Second Intifada, is an economic recovery. And the reality is if there is an economic stimulus that really gets to the people on the streets. I'm not talking about making the leaders wealthier, but I think that you're less likely to go and start problems if there's economic value to it. I think another thing that people have to realize about Israel, we're less than a century removed from the systemic annihilation of 6 million Jews simply because they were Jews. And I think that what you see in our country, the United States, happening as a result of the last 2 weeks, the rise in anti-Jewish attacks, the rise of anti-Semitism. We've heard for the last 4 years that it's the right, that they're the racists. Well, now we're seeing it manifest itself because, see, racism isn't about a right or left issue. But yet the question happens once again, where can a Jewish person feel safe? And we can't minimize the fact that the foundation of the state of Israel came 2 years after the end of World War II. And people were coming out of the concentration camps and nobody wanted them. I mean, it's so easy. And again, going to historical nuance, we want to say, well, the Nazis were the bad people. After the fall of Nazi Germany and Jews from the concentration camps were returning to their homes, their non-Jewish neighbors were saying, "Why are you here? We thought you were dead. Leave. We don't want you." In fact, there were many Jews that were killed on the return to their homes. This wasn't just a Nazi thing. It was something that was within the soil of Europe, bred there really for centuries, frankly. And so, you talk to Israelis and their attitude is that if we get rockets, we're going to do what we can to protect ourselves. Again, I think that we're right in asking the question, how you go about doing that, how you go about protecting yourself, and how much is too much. Those are fair questions that need to be asked. But we can't understand kind of where Israel is if we disassociate the fact that many of the people living in Israel have a direct relative that either was in the Holocaust. I mean, you can hardly ride a bus in Israel without seeing an elderly person that has a tattoo on their arm. And that memory is a part of how Israel does things. That doesn't excuse them. That doesn't give them a blank check. But we at least can't lose sight of that either.
Yeah, it's sort of an explanation as opposed to a justification in some of their
Right.
actions. But so going back to these rocket attacks, okay, because that's kind of what we've been talking about. Like what? So there was a reason why the rockets attacks were incited, right? And that's because of the evictions. So
Well,
then
there
maybe the
have been
question.
no evictions. There have been no evictions.
Really?
The Jerusalem court. Okay, so the issue with this was that Sheikh Jarrah as a neighborhood was founded in the 1860s.
So Sheikh
Around
Jarrah,
the 18
tell me that. What is Sheikh Jarrah? Is that in
Sheikh
Jerusalem?
Jarrah is this neighborhood in East Jerusalem. And in the mid 19th century, you begin to have people moving outside of the old city of Jerusalem. That's why we call it the old city, because that assumes that a new city is being built up around it. And Sheikh Jarrah was one of these neighborhoods. It was primarily an Arab neighborhood of two families. In the 1870s, I believe it was, a Jewish family came and bought the land, some of the land, not all of it, some of it. That these houses that are in contention now are sitting on, and they bought that land and lived in it until 1948. In 1948, as a result of the 1948 war, the Jordanians occupied East Jerusalem. They also occupied the West Bank. And when
Is that
the
where the Golan Heights
Jordanians
are?
took, no, the Golan Heights are up north and east of the Sea of Galilee. The Golan Heights, this was Syria. And so the West Bank, which is kind of the heart of the central hill country, and East Jerusalem were occupied by the Jordanians. And when that happened, the Jews that were living in those lands were forced out. They were forced to leave East Jerusalem. In 1967, with Israel now gaining control of both West and East Jerusalem, the Israeli courts said that they will honor whoever owns the deed to the land. Now, not just in the Sheikh Jarrah instance, but anywhere, including Arabs. The Jewish family that owned the deed to this land made an appeal to get the land back. The Israeli court said, no, you guys work it out. And basically it was set up in the court system that the Arab families that were there, who had been relocated by the Jordanians because they had been displaced because of the 1948 war, that they should pay rent. So what happened then is they contested this, and that's why it's been in the court since the 1970s. A couple weeks ago, a Jerusalem court ruled that they either have to pay back rent or they have to leave. Nobody's been evicted. And like I said, this case is going to go to the Israeli Supreme Court. It hasn't gone to the Israeli Supreme Court yet. It will. But the
So
way
no one's
that
been
this
forced
got
out.
correct. Having said that, though, on this instance, there have been other places where that has happened, but this became kind of the lightning rod. And so you have people saying that, they were being forced out and everything like this. And really, like I said, this issue is a legal issue. It's a legal case that, frankly, both sides have legitimate arguments on, but it's a question of, it's something that's going to get decided in the courts. But what it does is it raises a bigger question of what to do because of the modern history, right? Of this war and that war and so forth, what to do with people that have a right to, that lived on certain land that no longer is under their control. That's kind of the big umbrella that this is kind of falling under. And it's a question that often gets raised in discussions about trying to establish an Israel, you already have the state of Israel, but establishing a Palestinian state is some kind of reparations on those issues.
So it's super difficult to try to give a quick summary. Obviously, when we're talking about this conflict, because there's so much history involved and there's so much nuance that needs to be said. But if you could just give me, best you can, a quick summary of what the conflict is in 2021, maybe 2 to 3 sentences, just to kind of summarize some of the things that we've talked about today. Then I've got one last question and we'll close it out.
I think what you're seeing here is a struggle, not only between who is going to be the power broker of the Palestinians. I also would not ignore the fact that Hamas has connection to Iran and what potential role they could be playing in this. I think that we have an ongoing issue that the longer the current status quo just continues to kick down the road, we see that it is not a viable solution for either side.
So here's the last question, and it's a little bit, I won't say it's off topic, but it's definitely related, from Nikki. She says, thanks for your guest. As a Jew whose Messiah is Yeshua, what facts do you suggest we use to open eyes to the point of Joshua 1:9, that God is on his own side, and that's the side we want to be on?
I think that as followers of Jesus, I think that we have to take Jesus very seriously. Jesus says it's pretty simple to follow him. You love God, you love neighbor. In fact, Jesus is going to make the radical statement that you should love those who hate you. Now, it's interesting, he also allows that his followers could defend themselves, but Jesus calls upon us to love our neighbor who is like ourselves, to love our enemies. And I just asked this question, if those who were his followers had embraced that, how would 2020 look differently all over the world? To love those who hate you. It's not an easy place to live, because it means we live off in the middle, and we get caught in the crossfire. But I think if we're going to see, in whether it's the conflict in Israel and Palestine, whether it's the issues that we face in the United States or around the world, that if we're going to consider ourselves serious followers of Jesus, that we need to make part of our the essence of who we are, loving God, loving others who are like ourselves, even going so far as to love those who hate us.
Amen. So the last question I've got for you is, when's your next trip to Israel?
Well, Israel's not open yet for travel, but we are planning, we've got trips scheduled, provided things open up in the fall.
Does that make you sort of fearful, or the kind of conflict that's been going on over there? Does it?
Not at all. Not at all.
Why is that?
Because things tend to be very localized. I mean, yes, there were rockets fired, all over the country and things like this. But in general, you look at Jerusalem, it's a city of about 800,000 people. I feel much safer walking around just about anywhere in Jerusalem at almost about any time of the day, which I wouldn't in a comparable city in the United States. Israel is a very safe country. They take safety, very seriously. I would have no problem either, going into the West Bank. Like I said, I have a lot of friends that live in that area, and so
does your wife feel the same way?
Yeah.
She does?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's awesome. That's great. Yeah. So she must then go over there a bunch with you.
I would take my kids to, if Israel were open, I would load up my kids tomorrow and take them there with no concern.
Wow.
So and because once you have this ceasefire, you are going to find that it will be honored for a time.
Mm-hmm. So. All right. Well, I think that's going to do it for us today. But thanks again, Dr. Turnage, for coming on. This was thrown together extremely last minute. Yesterday, I had the idea. I was like, who can I have on to talk about this? And you were one of the first people that came to mind. As someone who's been over there, you're also a New Testament scholar, so you know your stuff. So just thanks again for coming on. I can't wait to have you on to talk more about the Bible and some other topics. So yeah, but thanks for coming
Cameron.
on. Is there anything you'd like to leave the audience with? I mean, we didn't really get a chance to talk about your work, but your windows into the Bible, maybe talk about just a couple things that you've got going on that people can get into. Your subscription service that you've got, your academic level courses and everything. All of that is really cool. I want to let the audience get a chance to maybe, include themselves in that, in your different initiatives. So go ahead.
Well, we have what is called Windows into the Bible University. Within that, we have courses and Bible studies. Our entire purpose is to enable and equip Bible readers to understand what did the Bible mean by entering the world of the Bible to better understand what it means for us today. And go to windowsintothebibleuniversity.com. And like I said, we have Bible studies, we have courses, we have a lot of new stuff that'll be coming online in the near future. We offer trips as well as the world begins to open back up from the pandemic. And then also we host podcasts, Windows into the Bible, that can be found on any of the podcasting platforms.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for coming on. We will see you guys in the next Capturing Christianity video, which I've got Dr. William Hasker on to give a defense of open theism. Should be super interesting. So stick around for that. We'll see you guys in the next video.